As we imagine brand Bharat, how do we imagine the relationship between industry and society?
As we think of Viksit Bharat, not only growing at a more rapid pace, but also in a more job-intensive manner.
First law is that to every economist, there's an equal and an opposite economist. And the second law is both of them are wrong.
Kautilya sort of envisaged a concept where Dharma plays a supporting role to both the state and the market, a foundational role.
Whatever we make in India, let's be proud about the fact that we built to last.
I personally believe we have the political machinery to absorb the shocks that might come out of it, and the transition is going to be very smooth. So I'm optimistic about India.
We are here to talk on a topic which is interesting, and I'm saying interesting because at one level, industry and society is actually something that's symbiotic. Industry exists within the society, but very often the fact that is it industry versus society is also a question that comes up automatically. Fundamentally, of course, it's the fact that industry exists to fulfill and solve problems the society has, and the society gives it license to exist and allow the resources it has. So it should really not be thing, but over a period of time, this topic has come about. But as we imagine brand Bharat, and we start thinking of what it can be over the next decade, I think what we will try and do in our session will be to see how do we imagine the relationship between industry and society in a manner that aids building this brand. And to do that, I'm joined by four wonderful people with very diverse experiences, backgrounds, and points of view that in my conversations with them, I'm already hugely excited. And the best way to show that is that I'm going to talk, they'll do the least of the talking. So what I'm going to do as a format is to request each one of the panelists to share their perspectives on this topic for a few minutes, and then we'll take questions from there. I have some questions, and I'm hoping that we'll have enough time for questions from the audience as well. So may I first request Ashish, and Ashish brings this interesting perspective. He's been a capital allocator, he's run businesses, now he's been deeply involved on the social side, runs foundations, he's been part of the policy. So that's that very rich perspective. And Ashish, with that and much more that you bring, your thoughts.
No, thank you, Lan. I think one of the key roles of industry is to create jobs. And while India has done a good job at growing at 6-7% over the last 3 decades, I think we can do a much better job. And as we think of Viksit Bharat, not only growing at a more rapid pace, 9-10% versus 6-7%, but also in a more job-intensive manner. So I want to talk about 3 areas in particular, which I think can make a difference if we were to prioritize these areas. The first is labor-intensive exports. Historically, I mean, even over the last 30 years as we have grown, we have really ignored labor-intensive exports. China dominates the world of labor-intensive exports. It has 30% global market share. In some categories, the market share is as high as 70-80%. India's global market share is just north of 3%, even though our biggest endowment is labor. And so if you look at a category like electronics, where our exports were 7 billion in 2014, now it's gone up to 30 plus billion. But China exports 900 billion of electronics. The Honorable Prime Minister just announced a $500 billion mission for electronics, which is what I think the country needs. It'll create another, 6 million direct jobs and probably 12 million indirect jobs. But what it'll need is a combination of things to happen. I think one of the things we've done in these sectors is addressed it incrementally. And what I see now is a coming together of 5-6 things that have to happen at the same time for us to be competitive. Obviously, PLI is working in some areas like mobile. We've seen it's been very, very successful. And now there's a component PLI. So some kind of incentive, which is for an infant industry to get started. We need to rationalize our tariffs. Our import duty on a weighted basis is about 9% for components. Vietnam is at sub 1%. So we really need to rationalize tariffs if we want to be competitive. We need large export zones. In Vietnam, there are 6 designated zones out of which this happens. In India, it's naturally started to happen around Hosur, Sri Perumbudur, in Greater Noida. But designating these zones and devolving power down so that the ease of doing business can really happen, the way we have a separate act for Dholera, needs to happen. We need labor laws to be flexed by the states. We need a dormitory policy, which is announced by the finance minister now, to get spelt out in some degree of detail. And anchor tenants to come in. Apple was one, which we keep talking about, but we need 10 other Apples. They may not be the same size as Apple, but we need the major OEMs to come because they'll bring their supply chain with them. So this is just one example of electronics where there is a $300 billion export opportunity and maybe a $200 billion domestic opportunity just in the next 7-8 years, and will create over 10 million jobs. Garments is an area where we've just given up. Our garment exports are something like $16-17 billion flat for the last decade. Bangladesh does 50 billion, Vietnam does 50 billion. China, despite having much higher costs, despite the China plus one, the issues with China, still has 150 billion. This is the most labor-intensive sector. Shahi Exports, our largest exporter, has $1 billion of revenue, creates 125,000 jobs. There's no other sector with this labor intensity. So Bangladesh, our neighbor, has created almost 5 million jobs, 90% for women in this sector. So I think a mission-like approach towards labor-intensive exports is what India needs. We need to go from 3% to 10% global market share. And then once we hit that threshold, aspire for 20% global market share in labor intensive. And it'll create tens of millions of jobs in India. And these jobs will have a multiplier effect on the domestic economy. A second area I'll point to, which is not as obvious, is actually labor export. So India already has been a large exporter of labor to West Asia. But if you look at the demographics of the OECD, they are going to need immigrants. Despite the rhetoric, I can assure you that while they may not want permanent immigrants, they will definitely want temporary immigrants. Japan already has 2 million migrants. South Korea has 1.5 million. And Europe, Germany wants drivers, cooks, you name it. Anyway, and the estimate is the Western world alone will need about 50 million people in the next 25 years. And I think India has the opportunity to be the provider of safe and responsible talent to the rest of the world. Because our people are good citizens when they go outside, and they have the requisite skill sets to make it happen. So yet another opportunity to create 10 plus million jobs. And for that, if you look, Philippines for me is a role model. What Philippines has done, Philippines gets almost 8.5% of its GDP in remittances. What it has done is it's got a department for overseas Filipinos. They have accredited private agencies, 3,400 private agencies who are the skill providers. They provided a credit guarantee for the loan taken by the individual for the skill, which is $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 to get the skill. They have harmonized their credentials with global. They have signed 65 G2G agreements. So they've created the enabling conditions for this to happen. I think India can do this too, and we can be the preferred supplier of talent to the world. And a third opportunity, and I know I need to wrap up, is tourism. There's been a lot of talk in Viksit Bharat itself. There's the aspiration to go to $3 trillion from almost $200 billion today. But I think in the next decade alone, we can triple our revenue from tourism. Our revenue from international tourism is paltry. It is very, very small today. And I think one way to get around it is what we have done in Kevadia. The Kevadia has a special act which designates powers to a CEO who then can develop the infrastructure, develop a tourism plan, the tourist experience, essentially devolving powers down. And we can take that destination management organization structure to many other locations across India, put more money behind this. The same way we're offering more industrial incentive today, I think we need to put more money. The ROI will be incredibly high in terms of investment in this sector. And it'll create tens of millions of jobs. So I just think we need to prioritize jobs. And these are three areas: labor-intensive exports, labor migration, and tourism, apart from a few others, that can all create 10 plus million jobs in the next 7-8 years.
Great. That was fantastic and crisp. Now I would like to, Mudit, I would like to come over to you. When I sort of was preparing for this session and I looked up the kind of work that Mudit had done and some of his blogs, I realized that we've got a, what you call a silent killer out here. He's done some amazing, he's so much data oriented. He's done such deep research on data. And he's written these lovely blogs which have sort of taken on many articles and stuff like that and kill them softly. So, Mudit, in your typical style, would you please talk about what you think as an economist at the intersection of industry and society?
Namaskar, good evening to all of you. Right now I was told, the lady who had curated this event, if there is one mistake she's made, it's me. To be very honest, I don't know. Whatever I had to say has already been said. In fact, the joke I wanted to crack has also been cracked. So I'm quite frankly very speechless. Having said that, what I would like to start with on a very serious note is there are two fundamental laws that govern economists. We've had an economist yesterday, we've had an economist today. The two laws about economists is that the first law is that to every economist there's an equal and an opposite economist. That's the first one. And the second law is both of them are wrong. So unbelievably, but having said that, I want to make a point on when I got this topic, in my own characteristic way, I read my emails very quickly. I forgot the and. I read this topic as industrial society. And I immediately framed in my mind what are the implications of industrial society or a modernized society, which the Prime Minister talks about in terms of Viksit Bharat. And immediately, as a student of economic history, institutions, and philosophy, it occurred to me that I should also talk about the cost of industrial society. And it's important to think about the cost of industrial society because the Industrial Revolution, which unleashed the industrial society, was perhaps the biggest social engineering program unleashed on humanity in the history of mankind. And this transformation essentially was, the pre-industrial society, the economics was embedded in society. Land, labor, capital, they were governed by social norms, traditions, culture. But in a modern industrial society, land, labor becomes a commodity. It's not a question, now these are not governed by interpersonal relations anymore. They are governed in the form of a commodity by a very, very interesting mechanism which in a market economy nobody controls, which is the price mechanism, which essentially is a very interpersonal thing. For example, if I as a commodity, my marginal productivity is zero, then my humanity doesn't really matter. I am immaterial from society's perspective. I no longer am a useful society, a commodity in society. And unfortunately, the mechanism in a modern society is that your value is not determined by you or what you bring to the table. It is determined essentially by how scarce you are. So it does not really matter whether you have value in use. What matters is value in exchange. If there are many people who can do my job, even if I work for 24 hours, my wages are going to be extremely low. So some of us who command a wage premium in a market-based society, they reflect not some intrinsic characteristic, but they reflect the scarce commodity in how scarce they are in commodity. But this social transformation that took place from pre-industry to industrialization was actually a very, very violent event as well. This did not happen in a very peaceful manner as one would imagine. It unleashed forces which also created, the cost of it was that you created industrial scale killing as well, industrial scale violence, which unfortunately the technology has two sides to it. At one end it can make life easy, but at the other end it can unleash sort of weapons that can kill at an industrial scale. And if you look at Europe, for example, if you look at yesterday, they were talking about development of Germany and Japan. Ultimately, its social transformation culminated in those countries eventually leading to World War II. And we know what happened in World War II. In terms of the scale of killing that took place, it was industrial scale. You have to, if you just marvel the technology that was being used, it was something which was totally unprecedented. And if you look at, even if you go back, you look at French Revolution, for example, this is precisely an industrial society, a transformation taking place, which is transforming a political system itself, right? And it unleashed in violence, which was totally unpredictable. If you come closer to the times we live in, if you look at, for example, the Iranian Revolution, what was the Shah trying to do? He was trying to modernize society. And what did the Ayatollah discover? He discovered that it was very difficult to teach people how to live. It was a lot easier to teach people how to die. So the whole Islamic revolution in itself was one of the first revolution of its kind because it was telling people to go back to the glorious past. It was not talking about the glorious future, but it was talking about the glorious past. So unfortunately, when we think about the industrial society, we think of the developed aspect of it, but the contradictions that are imposed on society because of this social transformation is something which, in my opinion, the present Prime Minister of India recognizes these contradictions. And I'll give you an example. Take, for example, the farm laws. My colleague, Shamika Raviji, she mentioned that the farm laws, the withdrawal of the farm laws was a bad idea. From an economics perspective, yes. But if you look at the sociological aspect of it, it was, in my opinion, a very smart retreat. Because once again, we are talking about getting a market-based economy where relationships, governance of norms are determined by the social norms, the traditions that are there in place. And there was resistance to it. The resistance comes to it because this modern society unleashes, it questions the traditional power centers. And if you look at another aspect of the violence the industrial society or the industrial revolution or the modernizing unleashed was on nature itself. Nature itself became a commodity. The question was that we thought that there's so much abundance of it that we need not price it. Right? So as a result, the kind of violence that was unleashed on nature itself, today we are asking that, have we done the right thing? Are we on the right path or not? And if you think about it, the Prime Minister's vision, it's surprising, that the political class understands this contradiction. Yesterday we had Professor Panagaria talk about labor laws. Ashish ji has also talked about labor laws. It's true that we need to reform labor laws. It's true when Professor Panagaria said that India adopted the socialistic system and that was a mistake. But from a political perspective, you have to ask yourself a question. Is your society ready for development and modernization itself? Is there a political mandate for modernization and industrialization itself? And I think whatever may be my political differences, this is the first prime minister who has made development into a political mandate. This is what he's trying to unleash in society, is to bring about a transformation without having to pay the cost that the society pays in terms of violence. This, in my opinion, is a very, very heroic step. So this strategic retreat that he makes, that he withdrew the farm laws, one has to keep in mind that he is unleashing in India a program of development that questions, that in fact challenges many of the traditions and norms that govern our relationship. Another violence that has been unleashed on society due to modernization is the family structure. Now, that's not the kind of violence, violence is always not necessary having any kind of bloodshed. But you look at when labor became a commodity itself, we asked for women to participate in the formal labor market. And what are we seeing in traditional society? If you look at Japan, South Korea, which were far more traditional than societies in Europe, their fertility rates have come down to be below 1. Right? If you look at Europe, their fertility rates are much higher than what you see in traditional societies like Japan and South Korea. And today the question is being asked on how do we revive that. So there is a cost to the industrial society, but what is remarkable in my opinion, at one end you have a prime minister who wants to modernize, but at the other end he does participate in traditional and cultural events. For example, the Ayodhya temple that was built in January. Very often as an economist, we are asked a question, what is the role that a leadership plays in this? The leadership is demonstrating to society that it wants to preserve the traditions and norms of society while at the same time, it wants to modernize. And the state has a very important role to play in this, because when labor becomes a commodity, when all relationships become a commodity, the social insurance which typical tradition and culture norms are providing are also going to disappear. You see, that is the cost of urbanization in some sense. I have not known my neighbor for a very long period of time. In fact, when my neighbor is going through some kind of a crisis, I'm not even aware of it. Then who has to step in? So therefore, a modern society requires a very strong state. A very strong state, because now we have nuclearization of family, commoditization of labor, which basically demands that the state, the traditional role which the family was putting, the social norms were playing, now that role has to be played by the government. And therefore, in that context, the welfare state becomes important. So it's not welfare state, developmental state. I think we economists have to look at the broader picture, bring in the sociological changes that will accompany modernization, and these costs have to be taken into consideration. And I'm very glad, actually, that we have a prime minister who's cognizant. I mean, if you look at the slogans, he's talking about life. I mean, how do we live a sustainable life? So at one end, he wants society to modernize, but at the other end, he's also reminding society through a political slogan that we have to be mindful and we have to be careful about the sustainable nature. And mind you, when we talk about China's modernization, we must not forget their attempt to modernize, which started with the Great Leap Forward, killed 40 to 50 million people. The state starved 40 to 50 million people to death. That was the start of the modernization program in China. So it's come at a huge cost. So in my opinion, I unfortunately viewed this topic as industrial society. I sincerely apologize for that. I prepared my talk from the perspective of industrial society, so I humbly acknowledge that this is not industry and society, but I think we have to be cognizant of the cost. I'm very glad that the political leadership is very cognizant about the social transformation of modernizing, and that to modernizing the largest and the biggest, and perhaps one could argue traditionally and culturally one of the most complex countries or civilization, which is a living civilization, which has a tradition, which has a deep-rooted tradition. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very
Fantastic.
much.
Thank you so much, Mudit, and in inimitable way, you really spoke of the topic and about the topic, and so thank you for that. And but that takes me to Sriram, and Sriram's research area, and we spoke a little about it, and also the books he's written is about the cultural context in policy making, and like he likes it, the way of life and how that informs policies both at industrial level and at overall macro level. Sriram would love to, and especially after having set the context of costs that Mudit brought about, I think this is a perfect stage for you to bring some of your research and wisdom that you picked up.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Namaskar to everyone. It provides a perfect segue to what I'm sort of going to discuss. I would start off with, probably two research questions, which sort of, determines my approach to both my books as well as some of the topics that we're discussing. The first question really is, I would like to go back to what Ashwin Sanghi mentioned a couple of sessions back, where, the concept of hard power, right? As India becomes a superpower, or in the path towards being a superpower, its ideas and its sort of historical context becomes far more mainstream. In the sense, the basic question one would ask is, what is the indigenous Bharatiya model of economic governance, right? It's a very simple question, but the answers are not, as clear. Is it the Swadeshi model? With a lot of respect for Swadeshi, I think Swadeshi is sort of a political phenomena which morphed into a sort of an economic entity for, in the context of the freedom movement and things like that. But if you really look at our past, thousands of years of Bharatiya history, when India and China were the top countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita, from 0C onwards, at least till the 17th century, you notice that this country has been consistently engaging with the world, which means trading with the world, exchanging ideas with the world, and sort of having an economic worldview which is far more inclusive than you could ever see. So this question led me to look at our past. If there are any economic frameworks that led to this progress, when you look at the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur, it's probably one of the most, intriguing monuments, besides being a temple, that despite so many centuries, it stands tall, and its architectural brilliance, and it's very difficult to even replicate even today. So did all these monuments just come out of thin air? I think that's a fair question to ask, right? Such, brilliance of, say, engineering and architecture, there had to be some sort of underpinning of a philosophy that sort of ensured or triggered such progress. So that led me to the Arthashastra, which is the Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is a 3rd century BCE text. Forgive me for sort of giving you some context, but I think it would, enrich the discussion. It provides an overview of the economics of what Kautilya thought about. And I, in my book, I address this through the prism of Dharmic capitalism. The idea of Dharma being sort of central to the thinking of Kautilya and a lot of our ancient thinkers, which looks beyond the binary of the state and the market. In the sense, in a modern sort of economic framework, we have the state which regulates, which taxes, and which sort of stimulates the economy. And then you have the market, which sort of, provides competition, enlarges firms, and creates the market space for ideas. Kautilya sort of envisaged a concept where, Dharma plays a supporting role to both the state and the market, a foundational role. And this is something that you see across a lot of these kingdoms. So in the first book, I sort of addressed this, define Dharma through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and harmony, and map to the role of the state and sustainable growth and wealth creation and things like that. And I extend that in my next book, which is Dharmanomics, just got released a couple of days back, which focuses on the common era kingdoms, the Cholas, the Pallavas, Pandyas, Kambojidesa and Cambodia, in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. and where you see various iterations of the same Dharma-based economic frameworks in all of these countries over thousands of years. And that includes even the temple-based economies, which we talk about, which is again, I think, an inherent core of Bharat and its importance in these societies. And the role of guilds, corporate guilds, which are like multinational corporations and things like that, right? So all these things sort of, it might sound historical, but I think it's very important to sort of draw inspiration from all these things, because if you look at all the Western models, even modern day capitalism is an offshoot of a Protestant ethic. So the Chinese economic model is an offshoot of a lot of their inherent ideas, the Chinese ideas. The same thing with the Japanese. In fact, the Japanese have a subdivision of economic history within the Ministry of Finance, which shows a lot of their indigenous ideas as a springboard for economic policy. Why I'm saying this is important is at some level we have to draw inspiration from some of these ideas, because the extension of all this is the way of life that we're talking about today. The Dharmic way of life is a representation of what we are today in terms of not just the societal choices that we make. We still have these temples in every other villages that you go to. For example, in Tamil Nadu, we have thousands of temples. Most of them in even a small village, you have a big temple and you have much smaller temples around. And one needs to look beyond the religiosity of these institutions. They provide an economic catalyst for that entire area. If there is one institution in a particular village in Bharat which triggers economic activity, it is probably the temple as an institution, as an economic institution. And the ecosystem around the temple is an economic institution. And this is a great opportunity for decentralized economic governance and expanding decentralized economic processes. So I think it's very important to sort of understand this, to look at the indigenous sort of economic model that we have, and then look at the way of life. The way of life is again an important construct. Similar to what Mudit said, norms, narratives, and institutions play a very important role in economic decision making, both at the individual level and at the firm level. So at the individual level, if you look at both, in terms of discretionary and non-discretionary spending, which is basically non-discretionary is essential spending. Discretionary is, in very simple terms, non-essential spending. Most of our expenditures are all linked to our cultural events throughout the year. If you take the maximum UPI transactions this year was during the week during Diwali, where most of us made most of our expenditures, discretionary expenditures during that year. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of the consumption cycle is dependent, especially on the discretionary side, is dependent on a lot on the cultural norms and narratives that we have. Similarly, if you look at the corporate world, if you take the top 15 companies in India today, at least 10, 11 of them are family-owned businesses. And family-owned businesses make economic choices based on the context and, more importantly, on the cultural norms and narratives. For example, Mukesh Ambani, when he's speaking to Jensen Huang recently, he talks about Diwali as sort of his new year, where he starts new projects and things like that. Whether it is Mukesh Ambani or whether it's individuals such as us, a lot of our economic decision-making is dependent on a lot of these cultural norms and narratives. And this is widely studied in the West, by the way. If you really look at Nobel laureates like Gary Becker, one of his earlier works was on the role of, say, discrimination and culture in society. George Eichelroth, who won the Nobel for 2001 on asymmetric information, has also done a lot of work on identity economics, which talks about identities, norms, and narratives. Abner Grieve from Stanford has done it. But in a land where culture is so integral, unfortunately, we haven't done much work to even understand this. So I think this is very important for us to sort of understand this, because eventually this way of life, which has persisted for thousands of years, is not going to go away. And its influence in economic policy and decision making is going to be there. And not just in terms of individuals, but in terms of industry as well. And I think it's very important to sort of further understand this. I think it comes to, and one needs to also see how it can help in policy making. So for example, we heard about the Kumbh Mela, which is going to happen in March. So the Kumbh Mela is the largest congregation of people probably in the world. But it's a huge opportunity for policymakers to experiment their policies. So, for example, if you want to create a Swachhata or a cleanliness drive, there's no bigger avenue to do that. So, these are all opportunities. I think the prism of which economic policy is viewed in this country needs to fundamentally change. Because much of post-independent, Bharat, most of the people who are involved, I have a lot of respect for them, but I think there's a lot of democratization of ideas that need to come, and how real Bharat functions. And lastly, I want to draw the Prime Minister again, like what Mudit mentioned. He's a perfect example of someone who understands this, really at a ground level. If you really think about the Prime Minister's, post-independence, he's probably the only Prime Minister, I think, after Lal Bahadur Shastri, who's experienced poverty. In the sense, really experienced poverty. So his ability to understand the power of, say, an Ujjwala Yojana, the power of a Swachhata, a Swachh Bharat, I think is a supreme sort of understanding of this way of life that I'm talking about. The ability for policy, if it is aligned to the way of life, to be far more effective than the other way around. If you have a bunch of policymakers sitting in Delhi, executing or showcasing policies which are sort of an anathema to the way of life, you're not going to get effective policy outcomes. There are going to be gaps. If you do it the reverse, I think it makes it far more effective. So if you take the example of, say, Swachh Bharat, right? If you notice that Swachh Bharat, in my view, has been far more effective in rural areas than in urban areas. One of the reasons, I ascribe is this ability of Saucham, which is cleanliness, I think, a definition of Dharma by itself, is inherently there in all our lives. We all try our best to be clean within our homes. If you sort of bring this ethos to the outside, to your neighborhood, through the mass, popularity and the campaign of the Prime Minister, you're able to see transformative changes in villages. For example, I've just been to a remote rural village in Tamil Nadu, which had an initial sort of Swachhata movement, and now I could see that most of the roads are very clean, except for the main bazaar road. The rest of it is it's almost on autopilot. So the effectiveness of policy has increased a lot more, in my view, because of when policymakers take policies and align it to the way of life. So I think the industry and society sort of discussion in the Indian Bharatiya context is far more complex, far more diverse. And I think it's high time that policymakers take a serious look at this. And one of my areas of research is to make an attempt to take a serious look at this, because if you really want to take the informal sector, the entire sort of, rural Bharat into action, while India becomes Viksit Bharat, I think understanding this is very, very important. Because if not, I think the buy-in that we seek from them in this transformation, is sought only through an understanding of this, in my view. Because we can do all the talk about all these big projects and, that's all great. But eventually, for the common man on the street, for him or her to have a buy-in in what we want to do on the transformation that we are seeking, I think there has to be an inherent, first of all, understanding, and then empathy and sympathy to where they come from, and then initiating policy in a way that is aligned to some of these needs. And the more we study them, I think, the more you will understand between the sort of confluence between industry and society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mudit. So Komal, and Komal sort of brings all this together on the ground with what she does with Dolce V, which is to cater to the aspirations of the Indian youth with Indian frugality. So how do you bring them all together, and what are your thoughts, Komal?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So Dolce V is a platform for pre-owned fashion. We're working to boost the circular economy because of the urgent environmental imperative. So I'll speak more from the consumer point of view, how the consumer fits into this aspect of industry and society. So why do we all need to take a minute in the middle of all this very high-level talk, infrastructure, jobs, all of this is very important. Why do we also need to take some time to think about the circular economy? For example, India, we already have a lot of customs that cause us to accumulate a lot of clothes. I think a lot of us can relate to this. Annual religious festival, buy new clothes, gift new clothes. Big life event, buy new clothes, gift new clothes. And on top of this, the way that our consumption is increasing is absolutely unparalleled. Our apparel industry is on track to reach a volume of over 40 billion pieces in the next 4 years. So for 1.4 billion Indians, that is a lot of clothes. Where are we going to keep them? Our storage capacity to keep these clothes is not increasing by that pace. And more importantly, our utilization capacity is limited by the fact that there are only 365 days in a year. So whether we have 100 or 700 clothes in our cupboards, there are only so many costume changes that one can make in a day. So we have to address this from both the demand and the supply side. And I think our sector really illustrates how industry can have a very unique opportunity at these moments where consumer behavior is making these big shifts to tap into these trends, turn them into something positive, instead of allowing them to become negative externalities of growth, negative externalities of consumption. So firstly, when you acquire pieces, we all want to see economic growth. Increase in consumption goes hand in hand with that. We have to find ways to accommodate increasing consumption. We have to find ways to accommodate a growth in aspiration. What are these people going to consume? We have to very actively and consciously nurture the circular economy as part of the mix of what people can choose from when they are making these aspirational purchasing decisions. Secondly, when people are looking to cycle out, either whether it's things from our closet or other things from our households, there's going to be a lot of excess in all aspects of what we consume. Spending our time, effort, resources on nurturing those industries that, again, look at channeling that excess productively, unlock economic value from it. Let me tell you, it's not easy to unlock economic value from this. There's a lot of logistics challenges. The unit economics can be really punishing. It takes someone really to put their heart and soul and that entrepreneurship zeal to crack this. People have tried, people have failed, we've got to keep at it. So these things are going to end up in the landfill if we don't facilitate that ecosystem of circularity. In the inaugural session, our Honorable Finance Minister, she talked about how India should be leading global standards. She gave the example of the pharmaceutical industry, and she charged us to think about other sectors in which we can play a leading role in setting global standards. And for many reasons, the apparel market is a perfect candidate for this, for many reasons. Firstly, a lot of people don't think of clothing as a source of pollution the way that we think of transport or electricity as a source of pollution, but it is. The fashion industry is responsible for 10% of our global carbon emissions. 20% of industrial wastewater is linked to just the dyeing and treatment of textiles. The average pair of jeans, the water that it takes to grow the cotton in just one pair of jeans is as much as a person drinks in 7 years. So if you are taking so much from the earth to make your product, if you are polluting so much into our planet to make what your industry is making, then at least we can say that have a minimum standard of durability. Whatever is made in India, whatever is sold in India, if we can have a policy that it should last at least 30 wears, then we're going somewhere. It's not too much to ask. It should not be thread-balled and unusable after 1 or 2 washes. And this is a big problem that has been documented extensively, that the quality of textiles, the quality of apparel that we make has declined. What you could buy from the same, at the comparative price 10 years ago, 20 years ago, from the same brands, our quality has dipped. We've allowed that to happen, and we need to stop it in its tracks before it gets worse. India has a very rich textile industry. It's a very big part of our economy, so we ought to take charge in spearheading this field. Another reason that I think that this sector is really calls for some kind of a policy focus is because there's something about the human psyche that makes us susceptible to fall into consumption patterns that even we don't want to be a part of. It's a little bit like how there's more awareness about social media these days. We don't want to be doom scrolling, and when we look at ourselves from a distance, we say, I don't want to be doing that, but in the moment, we can't help themselves. There is a very strong parallel here. There is something about cheap fashion, something that looks aspirational, something that looks hip, and the price is accessible, that even if you don't want to be consuming in that way, you're drawn into it in the moment. So we've all heard of Shein, the very successful ultra-fast fashion company, selling a lot of clothes, but is also courting controversy because obviously of its very high environmental footprint. Who are Shein shoppers? The average Shein shopper has an income of over 55 lakh rupees a year. They are spending over $100 a month on Shein clothes. And more interestingly, surveys have found that over half of them say that I consider environmental sustainability to be a very important part of my priorities. And over 67% say I am willing to spend more for something that is more environmentally sustainable. So there is a clear dissonance between how we see us, and this is not judging, pointing at anyone. This is just how we need to understand, okay, there are certain demographic groups that are susceptible, so what do we as industry and policy need to focus on? So there's a dissonance between how we see ourselves and how we want to act, which is why this is an area that is ripe for some kind of regulation, some kind of standardization in terms of the quality that we need to demand. And that's not to say, okay, now you can't make cheap clothes. I don't think anyone in this room subscribes to that kind of over-regulation, and it's deeply unfair to price out people with lower budgets from these kinds of aspirational pieces. So the least we could then say is at least whatever, whether it's clothing, whatever we make in India, let's be proud about the fact that we built to last.
Wow. Great. We've had some very interesting perspectives come, and I'm going to now just do one round of questions. Quickly, Ashish, one of the challenges, you talked of job creation as one of the things. Where do you see skilling and the gaps in skilling fit into that in the vision of the three things that you talked of? And we can just make it quick round. I do want to give at least one chance for a couple of questions from the audience. So skilling and gaps in skilling, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So my view is that the short-term skilling, which India followed for a long period of time, I don't think was very helpful. I think the model that we have now stumbled into, apprenticeships, internships, on-the-job training, demand-led training is much more meaningful. Also, we've got to remember that certain jobs don't require a lot of skills.
Right.
To win in the garments sector, I don't think we need a lot of skills. If you talk to any garments manufacturer, they'll tell you that in 2 to 3 months, the worker is skilled and productive already. So that sector requires a whole bunch of other policy reforms.
Right.
Frankly, the skilling doesn't matter so much. For overseas employment,
Sure.
it's very important. You're going to a different country, you need language skills, you need credentials that are harmonized with that of the other country, that are accepted, etc. So I think it depends on the job type.
Right.
But I'm very much in favor of demand-driven skilling versus just skilling
Yeah.
where it was being sort of done in the ether almost. Whereas now I think as a country, we have a much sharper model that we have developed.
Right. So
for training
clearly
people.
you're saying that different ways one can do that, and that's what we are now trying to do versus the older model of that. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. I think, of course, there's improvement to NAPs and things like that, but I think it's a great start. Even
Sure.
the Prime Minister's internship is a great start. I'm sure there'll be a lot of teething problems. It's a new issue. But eventually, it'll be great for our youth.
Sure. Thanks. Mudit, you gave this example of industrial society and the cost it paid. Based on research and in history, are there examples of where this has been done at relatively lesser cost? You gave all examples of extremely high cost in terms of deaths and stuff like that. Do you have examples where it's been done better that one could learn from?
Of course, India is the living example. Unfortunately, this cost of industrialization was born because we became commodities. Even today, the whole attempt is to make ourselves. For example, I ask my students a fundamental question, what is your price? Because everybody wants to go to the job market, right? I don't ask them the question on how useful you are, but your price is your value in exchange. So in India, it is for the first time that you have a political leadership that wants to manage the cost of trying to preserve your tradition while at the same time moving towards modernization. The only other country that tried to do it but failed was Japan. So if you look at the Meiji Restoration, the whole slogan was that we'll preserve whatever is good about our tradition and we'll modernize at the same time. But we know what happened. By the time Japan industrialized, it was the first Asian country to beat a European power in 1905. Right? It announced itself in the world stage during the process of industrialization. So I really think that what is being attempted in terms of the political, by the political class, I mean, you look at the slogan which is winning election. At one end, we want women to enter the labor force market. At the other end, the most popular slogan today politically is giving financial support to women who are in the household. You see, in some sense, what seems like a contradiction is a political class trying to manage a contradiction in a peaceful way, which has never been attempted before. Attempts in the sense that nobody wants violence. It just is an unintended consequence of modernizing. And I really think that, I'm really, really amazed at this because it is easy to criticize people who maintained status quo in the past, by saying they could have been a market economy. They understood the political implication of modernization. Examples were evident to them. And the other aspect I want to highlight is modernization does not happen because individuals want to modernize. We have to modernize because it is a necessity. You see, in 1962, when we faced China, China's per capita GDP was lower than ours. Chinese economy today, and I think the finance minister is very cognizant of the transformation that is taking place, is worried. We are very worried about their aggression and expansionist. So we have no option but to modernize if we have to stand up to tendencies that will emerge. So we have no choice. But we have to do it with the least internal strife as possible. And that's why you see repeatedly political sloganeering apart. You are looking at why women, why not men, don't the men feel discriminated that they're not being given the money, 4,000, 5,000 rupees? I'll be happy to receive that kind of money. But the women, because women is a source of our family tradition. Right? So you see the challenge that has to be managed, or the contradiction that has to be managed. I think India is one of the examples that is doing it through a democratic process. No other country has experimented industrialization through a democracy. Yesterday, I think Mr. Ram Madhav talked about political systems, what do they have to do with modernization? Right. A lot. In fact, there's no empirical relationship between democracy and growth. But only recently did we see that democracy does cause growth, but not for the reasons that you think that they do. Democracy leads to growth because the non-democratic countries have been sanctioned by the powerful democratic countries. It's not that there is anything intrinsic in democracy which leads to growth. So you see, when you look at this research, you look at the contradiction, I'm just amazed at how the political leadership can consume such kind of sophisticated argument and come out with a practical plan which has to be implemented on the ground, not being discussed in some parlor or the other.
So managing contradiction through coexistence. Fantastic. Thank you, Mudit. Sriram, you talked a lot about the local economy, and you talked the examples of the village kind of thing. One aspect, which I'm just taking off from what Komal said, is about conservation. We talked too much about ESG and stuff like that, but environment was always a part of the whole of thing. And that's naturally embedded. And you've talked a little bit about that in your book as well. Would you like to just talk, how do you think about that and how that's integrated?
Yeah, I think that's a natural sort of, consequence. One of the differences, I mean, again, referring to Mudit, I think in the case of Bharat, there is one distinct difference, is that the way of life that I sort of was articulating is inherently has sustainable practices, not as some instrument of the state telling you to be sustainable, right? So there's a sort of a distinct difference there, because it's inherently peace-loving, inherently inclusive, and it's inherently sustainable in a lot of its activities. So you don't need a sort of a,
Mandate kind of stuff.
a state sort of giving a mandate, an incentive to do this. Of course, it needs to provide an incentive to sort of get their buy-in and sort of aligning it to their way of life, which I mentioned. But it doesn't really need an external sort of, state to come in and create an awareness about all these things to them, because they are inherently doing it. So to take it to the neighborhood and the society, of course, the state needs to sort of machinate that. So I think that's a very subtle but very important difference, right? Even if you look at Kautilya's time, 3rd century BCE I'm talking about, right? He views it through the prism of responsibilities, right? Familial responsibilities, societal responsibilities, environmental responsibilities. There are a lot of inscriptions which talk about the need to protect the environment, the need to reduce the amount of waste, the need to protect wildlife, and a variety of these sort of mentions are there in a lot of these texts. So I think when you look at it historically, there has been an attempt by a lot of ancient thinkers to also look at it through that prism. So I think, in a sense, for us to make this transition, we are inherently at an advantage, right? How do we sort of utilize the advantage? That is the smartness of the state and the shrewdness of the state, and how the state tries to understand this in the process of the transformation, right? So even in the Japanese sort of, model, the Japanese still are even now fighting that battle, in the sense, how do we, ensure that because their society is very inherently sort of resisting to a lot of changes that the modern state wants it to do. So how do you sort of do this is I think, a challenge for the state, more so in a democracy, because you want to have political outcomes which play a very important role in economic decision making, or if you want to pursue a set of these reforms. So a sort of an alignment is needed. But first, I think there needs to be an awareness. The political class is the awareness, by the way.
Right.
Because they see it day in and day out. I mean, they wouldn't articulate it in the way that I'm articulating,
Sure.
or we are articulating, because that sophistication is not needed for them, because they really see it on the ground, right? But the policy class needs to come to terms with it.
Sure.
Because the policy class, most of them, post-independence, are from some privileged background or the other.
Sure.
Right? Either from a bureaucratic background or from an educated background from abroad. So, for example, there's a good friend of mine who is probably in his 70s. He was mentioning to me that he did his PhD from an Ivy League school in 1972. In 1972, my grandmother was trying to find food for, probably through once a day, when they're literally in deep poverty, right? That is the contextual differences we're talking about,
Sure.
right? That most of the policy makers, especially pre-liberalization, were, sort of well-intentioned, quite a few of them, but their backgrounds were very different to what the people were.
Sure.
So in a post-reform society, the aspirational class is coming up more and more.
Right.
And the aspirational class is sort of taking center stage on a lot of these ideas. So policymakers, I feel, need to attune themselves to, and answering a question, I think the idea of sustainability is intrinsically there.
Right.
So it's about us, how do you take policy to sort of trigger that and make it into a movement in this transformation that Mudit was mentioning.
Okay, thank you. Komal, simple question to you. What does it take to create 100 more such organizations so that this sustainability and the sensitivity to that environmental becomes an integral part of brand Bharat?
So it's a very tough endeavor. Our sector is like a littered graveyard. There have been companies that are publicly listed in the US that have come to India and left. And many people are questioning, what are we doing hanging on? We're here as Indians because we care. I come from a development economic research background, which is what introduced me to this area. And this may be the wrong thing to say in certain audiences, but there's different kinds of entrepreneurship. If entrepreneurship is driven by, I want something that in day one is investable and has this very clear roadmap, this is probably not the right track for you. There's another kind that says this is a problem. This is a solution that can happen. We need to achieve a certain scale and we need to build the market as we go along. But it takes, I think, that kind of crazy person to put their life into it, because we can't expect government subsidies, viability gap funding, all of that. But we're lucky that our market is huge. We're lucky that our market is open-minded. There's a consciousness that this is where the world is headed. I think we were discussing earlier.
Right.
So this sector has largely flown under the radar of India somehow, but it is taking over the world. So even as recently as 2022, reports have started coming in that, for example, the US has reached the halfway tipping point. Over half of consumers in the US who shop for fashion each year shop pre-owned. People in India are shocked by this. It is unimaginable to so many of us. But it's beautiful to see the kind of demographic diversity that we see on both the demand and supply side. People from villages selling their old saris, people in luxury high-rises in Mumbai buying them. It is a beautiful thing. So what would it take? I think everything that encourages an entrepreneur. We've spoken a lot in this conference. A lot of people have spoken about regulatory malaise, cholesterol in the regulatory system. And even at our relatively small scale, it is something that we bump into far too often. We know that there's a lot of leadership on the top that is working very hard to clear this. But until that is prioritized in a sector that is already so difficult to manage the logistics and the unit economics of, if that is not cleared, it will kill a lot of such industries in their track.
And maybe to go back to what Ashish said, maybe this is one of the things that we might export. But on that one, I think I will take one question from the audience. Since I promised, yeah, there's one there.
Hi, my name is Dr. Subhi Chaturvedi. I lead global public policy for India's first unicorn. For the longest time taught at Delhi University, Law, Media and Society. My questions to you, Ashish. If you were India's Chief People Officer, you spoke about ease of doing business, labor-intensive economies. The second fundamental pillar of convergence, as we see, is human talent and talent development. What would be your top 3 priorities? Because we need more of Ashish's, so to speak, for building brand Bharat. You're a builder of institutions and you get wartime, peacetime CEOs, you get people with transferable skills. We don't see that either from the demand side or from the supply side happening enough. Over to you. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think on the human capital side, I think there are 2-3 key areas. One is early childhood development. We know it's so important. It's a stage where the brain is being developed and it goes hand in hand with malnourishment, proper nourishment, care, etc. Foundational literacy and numeracy. We know that in India today, 55% of the children by class 5 can't read 3rd grade text. We can't build a just and equal society, give people opportunities, unless in the early years, we give them the foundational skills to succeed. And then finally, the bookend, which is more preparing people for life, the apprenticeships, the internships, relevant skilling. I still believe demand is more important than supply. Supply responds to demand. It's my sense. So the relevant training for the workforce is the third area that I would pick. Thank you.
Great. Okay, one more, since he's already stood up and has the mic in hand.
So always be ready, sir. My name is Dr. Abhishek Puri. I'm a radiation oncologist from Mali. My question is to Mr. Mudit. I also dabble in a little bit of AI. So you described the industrial revolution as a real revolution where heads were being chopped off and a lot of blood was flowing in the streets. How do you see the AI? I want to know the economist perspective. How do you see the AI impacting our society, because we are neither industrialized nor we are technologically there. So
Yep.
I'm not an optimist, but I'm not a pessimist either.
Don't get me wrong, I am an eternal optimist, because my definition of optimism is things could be much worse. Right? We're sitting here, it's a good sign. Having said that, you see, when computers came, a question was asked to the Economist in the 1980s. I see computers everywhere, but I don't see it in productivity. I think it's too early to talk about AI and its impact on average productivity. You will be surprised to know, at least in the Western world, the Industrial Revolution 3.0, which is for the first time, primarily European countries, this is after a gap of almost 120 years, that the average productivity growth is less than 1%. This is, in the modern times, it has not happened. So I think it's too early to talk about the impact of AI on the average productivity. Right? A lot of people are talking about, it's a threat to the economy, threat to the labor. To be very honest, it's too early to say anything on how it's going to transform the way people use the technology to become more productive. I used AI today to write a paper. It makes me more productive. So should I say ChatGPT is bad? No, it summarizes, the article for me in the most interesting way I could think of. Right? So I think it's too early. We should not be pessimistic for sure, because I do trust that society has tremendous capacity to transform. But the cost is that, unfortunately, anything modern that comes, even what Ashish is trying to unleash in terms of education, you will be really surprised to know the modern mass education, which started with everybody being able to read the Bible. The whole objective was to make the laity out of the common people. The initial cost of it was very violent, because you can imagine, when I become more educated than my father, should I respect his authority? Does he have anything interesting to tell me? He has been respecting his father, right? So it's too early to tell, but I can assure you one thing, that society also has tremendous way to transform itself. Sometimes there is an expense, there is a cost associated with it, but I am confident that in India, the political dexterity that we have seen will be able to manage this transformation as well in the most constructive way. If this political, you see, the other day I was reading a letter which Nehru wrote. Nehru said that the bigger threat to India than communism was Hindu nationalist movement. It's a letter, he wrote it. But it's the same political structure that has given us a prime minister who we might say at a certain level is the opposite of Nehru, but in certain way also has the same vision in terms of India, right? There is a contradiction over there. But it's the same political system that has given a nobody, literally a nobody, made him the prime minister with one of the largest mandate, not only in India, but across the world. Now, I might disagree whether this is correct or wrong. Whatever are my political inclinations is besides the point. But I have to respect that political mandate. And this happened. This transfer of power happened in the most peaceful manner. So if this can happen in India, where we are not even developed, questions of peaceful transfer of power are being raised in the developed world. right? If it can happen, then I think we are ready for AI and its transformation. I personally believe we have the political machinery to absorb the shocks that might come out of it, and the transition is going to be very smooth. So I'm optimistic about India. I just wanted to lay out the cost.
Thank you. And on that optimistic note, let's thank the panelists, and may I request you to give a round of applause to the panelists. Thank you for a wonderful
very much.
conversation.